There's certain things that I've done just for my own self-preservation, but also that I've applied to the brand and for the people that are incredibly supportive. I know, the question can be around naysayers, but if you really see the groundswell of support that surrounds the brand and me, that's what I feel the most, and that's what I appreciate.
Meghan did not simply walk up on a whim. She arrived the way she invariably does: calculated, structured, and thoroughly prepared. She anticipated the familiar choreography of elite luxury retail: a discreet side entrance, a senior boutique director already positioned and waiting, a seamless transition into a private consultation suite, and the kind of reverential attention that regards a guest not as a paying client, but as dignitary. What greeted her instead were those two guards and a statement that was not, under any conceivable interpretation, the spontaneous judgment of an anxious, low-level staff member. Those 10 words, "We have been instructed not to accommodate you at this time," were the precise execution of a directive that had been formally authorized months prior within the limestone walls of Chanel's storied headquarters on Rue Cambon in Paris. This was not a breakdown in communication. This was not a diary clash or a logistical oversight. This was not a boutique temporarily closed for an exclusive private engagement. This was the nuclear option. Within the high-pressure internal vocabulary of Chanel's brand protection division, the nuclear option represents a policy so uncommon, so uncompromising, and so irrevocable in its nature that the overwhelming majority of employees will pass through their entire professional careers without ever witnessing it carried out against a single individual. On a crisp afternoon on Rodeo Drive, Beverly Hills, Meghan Markle emerged from a black SUV dressed in a custom ivory capecoat, carrying herself with the effortless confidence of a woman accustomed to red carpets rolling out at her mere approach. This time, however, the welcome never came. Two expressionless security personnel stepped directly into her path. No acknowledgement, no apology, no clarification. Simply a wall of bodies and 10 blunt words delivered without ceremony. "We have received instructions not to serve you at this time." Chanel, a fashion house that has adorned royalty, world leaders, and cultural luminaries across more than a century of unrivaled elegance, had just openly, intentionally, and irrevocably closed its doors on the Duchess of Sussex, right there on Rodeo Drive, in broad daylight, surrounded by onlookers and rolling cameras. What unfolds from here is the complete account. The confidential file assembled in Paris, the exposed correspondence that ignited this collapse years earlier, the tense boardroom standoff, the creative presentation that reduced every remaining bridge to cinders, and the scene where Prince Harry arrived in haste only to be dismissed with a single silent gesture. This is not the tale of a retail visit that went sideways. It is the account of how one of the most recognizable women alive was methodically and conclusively shut out of the most guarded industry on the planet, and how every warning had been plainly visible long before she ever approached that entrance. The moment the world abandoned its diplomatic silence. Let us reconstruct the complete sequence of events that played out before the Chanel Beverly Hills flagship that February afternoon, because every precise detail carries considerable weight in understanding exactly what this confrontation truly represented. It is preserved exclusively for those deemed to have breached the house's intellectual confidence or generated what the brand internally categorizes as a reputational contamination threat. Once it is activated, it is all-encompassing. No access, no scheduled visits, no borrowed pieces, no connection of any description whatsoever. The individual is not simply turned away at the door, they are completely expunged. And according to multiple eyewitnesses, among them staff members from the neighboring Dior boutique who observed the entire episode from beginning to end, What transpired next was nothing short of remarkable. Meghan stopped cold. Her hand, mid-motion over her phone screen, ceased moving altogether. Her entire frame tensed visibly beneath the warm California afternoon light. For several drawn-out seconds, the quiet that settled over that particular stretch of Rodeo Drive was total and consuming, the precise variety of silence that descends only when something genuinely staggering has taken place and every person present is still struggling to comprehend what their eyes just witnessed. And then the disintegration began. Onlookers described her beginning to pace erratically back and forth across the sidewalk, resembling a mechanical toy incapable of powering itself down. Her volume climbed sharply. She retrieved her phone and placed an urgent call to Prince Harry. Bystanders positioned close enough recounted hearing her words with striking clarity. She was declaring that people would lose their positions, that no one possessed the authority to subject her to this kind of public humiliation, and that those responsible had absolutely no comprehension of exactly who they were dealing with.
Sit with that image for just a moment. A woman who endured and outlasted the grinding internal mechanisms of the British royal institution. A woman who sat opposite Oprah Winfrey and laid bare her truth to an audience of 50 million people worldwide. A woman who walked deliberately away from one of the most formidable establishments on the planet and constructed an entire media enterprise from the ground up. Now standing on a sun-scorched Beverly Hills pavement, trembling with barely contained rage because a fashion house had refused her passage through its entrance. But the narrative was about to escalate into something considerably more theatrical. 20 minutes after that phone call connected, Prince Harry materialized on the scene. He stepped out, visibly drained of color, jaw locked firmly in place. His composure technically preserved, but transparently under enormous pressure. The Duke of Sussex, bearing a royal title, the weight of the Windsor name, and undeniable worldwide recognition, approached the head of Chanel's security detail directly and made a deliberate attempt to negotiate their admission. He was controlled in his manner. He was restrained in his delivery. He appealed to the man steadily and with quiet but unmistakable authority. The security officer's reply came not in words but in gesture. A single, unhurried, unambiguous shake of the head. Not even for a duke. The answer remained no.
Not for a duchess, not for any living soul on earth. By this point, 3 separate individuals in the gathered crowd had their recording devices actively capturing the scene. The entire 12-minute standoff was being documented in unfiltered real time. And as those recordings began circulating outward across platforms and feeds, a slow and sobering realization began crystallizing among the watching public. This was no accident. This was no over-eager guard operating beyond the boundaries of his designated authority. This was the precise, meticulously pre-engineered public execution of a verdict that had been formally delivered in Paris well over a year before that afternoon ever arrived. The velvet rope had not merely been drawn back. It had been charged with a current that nobody was getting through, regardless of their title, their fame, or their connections. Drop your thoughts in the comments right now. Did Chanel overstep every reasonable boundary here? Or was every single element of this response entirely and completely warranted? We are personally reading each and every reply that comes in. The nuclear file. What Paris already knew. Here is the critical piece of context that virtually nobody watching that circulating footage had any awareness of whatsoever. The resolution to bar Meghan Markle from entry was not reached in February 2026. It was not conceived in a moment of reactive panic or triggered by some recent controversy or fresh provocation. It was determined more than a year beforehand, within the private conference suites and ornately appointed offices of Chanel's central headquarters on Rue Cambon in Paris, following the painstaking and methodical construction of what those within the inner circle had begun referring to quietly as the nuclear file. The nuclear file was a dossier, substantial in volume,
exhaustive in its detail and utterly devastating in its conclusions, assembled with deliberate care by Chanel's dedicated brand integrity division. It represented a thoroughly documented pattern of conduct stretching back across more than 2 years, reviewed and scrutinized at the absolute uppermost echelons of the house, and ultimately bearing the formal authorization of Bruno Pavlovsky, the sitting president of Chanel's fashion division. To fully grasp the contents of that file, it becomes necessary to travel back to December 5, 2024. Meghan arrived at the Chanel atelier in Paris under the protective cover of what her accompanying team characterized publicly as a cultural collaboration visit. On the surface, a prestigious and carefully managed appointment between a celebrated public figure and a legendary creative institution. According to 4 former members of staff who were physically present throughout that day, the atmosphere inside shifted to something uncomfortably frigid within mere minutes of her arrival. Meghan did not present herself as a client. She did not carry herself as an invited guest of the house. She conducted herself, according to every single person occupying that room, as though she were the newly appointed creative director assuming her rightful position. She demanded unrestricted access to confidential sketches from the upcoming 2025 Métier d'Art collection, a privilege that is virtually never extended to any outside visitor under any circumstances. When the attending archivist showed reluctance, she reportedly launched into a series of unsolicited directives entirely without invitation. She proceeded to inform the House that it ought to shed what she personally characterized as its French rigidity in order to forge a more meaningful connection with a contemporary and emotionally engaged audience. She volunteered her perspectives on narrative construction, on brand positioning, and on precisely how the House might transform itself to reach the consumers it was presently and fundamentally failing to capture. And then arrived the moment that generated a silence no one present in that room would ever succeed in forgetting. She submitted a request that a specific silk trim currently in development be officially renamed in her honor, not within the framework of any licensing arrangement, not in exchange for any defined commercial understanding, but simply because, as she apparently conveyed with complete seriousness, her personal brand represented the singular missing element that Chanel's century-old legacy had been lacking all along. One staff member, speaking exclusively under strict anonymity, later recalled the atmosphere that followed. She fundamentally failed to grasp that Chanel is not an incubator designed to cultivate celebrity vanity. It is a temple, and inside a temple, you do not presume to instruct the clergy on the practice of worship. This visit did not exist in isolation. It represented merely the final recorded entry in a behavioral pattern that had been carefully documented since the early months of 2023. The nuclear file contained leaked correspondence in which Meghan's personal representatives had issued demands for co-creative credit on a limited edition handbag capsule, not a carefully worded partnership proposal, but an outright demand delivered without apology. They were not extending an invitation toward collaboration. They were asserting an unconditional claim to a seat at the very table where the Wertheimer family, the intensely private billionaires who hold complete and total ownership of Chanel, had presided with absolute authority across multiple generations. By the closing weeks of December 2024, Pavlovsky formally executed the retrait définitif, the decree of permanent and total withdrawal. The ruling was absolute and carried binding authority across every territory on the globe. No admittance at any location anywhere in the world, no privately arranged appointments, no borrowed pieces or product loans, no affiliation or association of any nature whatsoever. Her name was systematically purged from every guest registry, every showroom access record, every influencer tracking document maintained across the entire organization. Regional directors spanning every operational territory received a classified Tier 1 non-engagement directive without exception. In private internal conversations, the particular phrase circulating quietly among the most senior executives to characterize the situation was both precise in its construction and deliberately clinical in its tone. Tactically uninsurable. Not rooted in malice, not driven by anything remotely personal. Simply a cold, dispassionate, and thoroughly institutional evaluation of an unavoidable commercial reality. The underlying calculation was straightforward and unflinching in its logic. Every single time Meghan Markle entered a room, the surrounding conversation ceased to have anything whatsoever to do with the artistry of the craftspeople or the integrity of the clothing itself.